Well, hello there, my friends. Welcome into another episode of the Winsome Creationist podcast. So excited to be joining you today. I've been thinking about something because we're getting ready to go through a series in our adults small group at church. And it's this idea of how to have great conversations. And I know that's something we often talk about in sort of abstract ways around here. Obviously, we want to be winsome, we want to be engaging. And one of the chief ways that I have accomplished this in my own work and talking to people and having conversations around the subject matter of lots of things, but creationism in particular, is by using Greg Koukl's tactics. And that's what we're going to be doing in our adults small group, going through the tactics series. And I thought today we'd get real specific and talk about what Greg calls the Columbo tactic. All right. Now, if you are not familiar with Greg Koukl or his organization Stand to Reason or Columbo, the namesake of the tactic, don't worry, I'm going to try to talk through all of those things here today. So Greg Koukl is a Christian apologist and speaker. He is not a young age creationist, and I have taken issue with his views on that at various points. Nevertheless, I really respect Greg, and he is known for just helping people think clearly and have fantastic conversations. And, maybe some of those conversations lead with unbelievers to the gospel, with other believers lead to a little bit more, at least clarity and understanding, and hopefully even persuasion around different views that we might hold. I mean, if we think things are important to us, then we should really do our best to be persuasive on those things. A lot of times, though, we're not. A lot of times, and especially creationists are bad for this, we get into these shouting matches, right? And we start talking over one another, and we just tell people what we believe instead of inviting them to consider it. And one of the things that I talk about in the upcoming book, The Winsome Creationist, is really leaning into my marketing background. And something that we get wrong is we often think that we can control people, right? We often think that if we just shout loud enough, if we're so logical with our arguments, that we can help people to see the light. When the reality is that people often have to see the light on their own. The best persuasion happens without someone even know they're being persuaded. Usually just over time, they're persuaded towards a view. And it's got to be their idea. That's how you sell things, when something is their idea instead of it being your idea. So the more compelling you can make young age creationism look, the better. And a lot of times that comes down to asking great questions. And in fact, that is the heart of the Columbo tactic. So I'm going to explain it. And again, my goal for this podcast is just to equip you with this tactic. If it's the only tactic that you use, you could go so far with just this one tactic, and frankly, with just the first question that we're going to get into. We'll talk about it in a minute. But you can use this to persuade others towards young age creationism, or at least questioning the view that they currently hold, while staying calm, curious, and compelling. So if that's something that interests you, then please hang around. I think you are going to find this to be very helpful. Okay, so you know the drill, right? Someone says, maybe you're in a small group setting, or you're talking to an atheist friend or whatever, and someone says the earth just can't be 6,000 years old. Science says it must be billions of years old, and blah, 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 and here's all the reasons. And if you're a passionate creationist like me, suddenly it's a showdown, right? And, who's got the most facts and logic? If you're not a passionate creationist, which I know most of you listening are, but you might remember back to a time when you weren't, or that others who aren't and how they interact, it could be intimidating. Because oftentimes people who are passionate about the subject, on the other hand, coming from the billions of years old perspective, have lots of data that they point to, and lots of researchers that they can point to, and see, well, all these people and all these science textbooks and blah blah blah, and they can really overwhelm you. So if you are equipped, a lot of times you're just in a shouting match trying to yell louder than they are. And if you're not equipped, it can really terrify you. And I've seen it drive people away from the faith. No matter which position you find yourself in, this Columbo tactic by Greg Koukl is just a brilliant way to flip that script, stay in control in the conversation. And if you're fortunate enough and God uses it in this way for you, maybe even change some minds, which is really cool. So by the end of this episode, I'm going to give you 3 simple questions that you can have in your toolkit and some real examples of how to use them to defend a young earth, of course, very winsomely. Now, let me just give one caveat. I'm a little under the weather, so I'm speaking a little softer than normal. My voice is a little strange. I apologize. Hopefully you still find this to be a useful episode. I didn't want to just not record an episode even though I'm feeling a little sick. So pray for me if you will. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this Columbo tactic. Okay. Now, you're already sold on the core concepts of young age creationism, right? You got it all down. Genesis, the genealogies, the flood, completely reshaping the planet. But we know that getting others on board is not so easy. And that's where things tend to get messy. So this Columbo tactic, which is named after the quirky old TV detective, is really, really great because it's about asking questions, smart, curious questions to help guide the conversation without just firing off a, machine gun's worth of facts. If you're not familiar with Columbo, I would really encourage you to go to YouTube and type in Columbo episodes and just go back and watch Lieutenant Columbo in action. It's really fun. I like to sometimes just go back and watch just to really learn by osmosis, because I'm telling you, it's such a cool thing. And basically, Columbo was just a very unassuming kind of detective. In other words, he got you off balance because he looked a little bumbling. He looked a little not put together. He always had to bum a pen off you. He asked a lot of questions. He was annoying a little bit. Well, he was annoying to the bad guy because he kept asking the bad guy clarifying questions that eventually led the bad guy to give up the jig, right? And that's why Greg Koukl talks about putting a stone in someone's shoe, and people will figure that the Christian's going to be annoying. So he's like, well, you're already expecting me to be annoying, so I'd like to annoy you, but in a good way and really make you think. And so that's kind of how the Columbo tactic goes. And I don't have time for a whole marketing psychology lesson, but there's so much in here about how people think and how marketers have even exploited and sort of used how people think, and not just marketers, but negotiators. For example, in a negotiation, it's a well-known tactic to just be a little bit more, let me say it this way, a little bit less put together than your opponent or adversary in the negotiation, right? Because if you come across as intimidating, then it makes it harder for the other person to trust you. So the more real you can show yourself to be and the less intimidating you come across, the more that the negotiation partner trusts you. Same with the conversation partner, okay? So the less you come across like you've got all your ducks in a row and you've got everything put together, and the more you come across with curiosity and understanding and willingness to learn, being what Greg Koukl calls sly like a fox, right? Being sly, being a little unassuming, but being like a fox, being really smart and being able to drive the conversation. I like to come to conversation sort of like a loaded gun, not a discharged gun, but a loaded gun, okay? Meaning that I like to, my favorite kind of conversations are the ones in which I have a lot of domain knowledge, but I don't spray that knowledge all over the place like an out of control, a paintball gun or something like that. Okay. I don't need to paint the wall with my ideas. I just need to have the ideas in my back pocket. And by the way, these tactics work even if you don't have the ideas in your back pocket. But if you do, all the better, because then you can use guiding questions to help people come to the conclusion that you'd like them to come to, but it's their idea the whole time. And again, this is not manipulation. You can actually use these tactics in a bad and manipulating way. That's not what we're doing here. We are simply trying to get people to come to an understanding of the truth on their own without just having to take your word for it. That's all we're trying to do, and we want to be careful about how we go about that process in order to make sure that the conversation stays level-headed. Because, as Greg says, if anyone gets mad, I lose. If somebody in the conversation gets mad, then we lose. We can't move the conversation forward. Okay, so the Columbo tactic has 3 elements to it, 3 questions that work in various phases of the conversation. Okay, one question, the first one, is a question that has to do with gathering information. The second one has to do with reversing the burden of proof. And the third one has to do with using a question to make a point that would challenge the other person on their view. Okay. So the first question, and Greg calls these model questions because the question isn't always going to look like this. But it's some variation of the question. What do you mean by that? Okay, so it gets them to clarify their objection. And the premise behind this question is that most of the time when you're in conversations with people, they don't actually have the knowledge to navigate their objection very clearly. They're simply repeating what they've heard other people say. Okay, so in other words, somebody might say something like, and we'll go into this specific example, more in depth in just a minute. But somebody might say something, well, don't you know that the Earth proves, or that geologists have proved that the Earth is, 6,000 or is billions of years old through radiometric dating? You got all kinds of questions. What do you mean by that? Questions that you could ask them there. And we'll talk more about that here in just a minute, okay? The second question is about reversing the burden of proof, right? And this model question is, well, how did you come to that conclusion? In other words, let's say that you've got them clear enough on number 1, which many times you're not. Many times in a conversation, you're not even going to get past question number 1 because it turns out that you are more knowledgeable about the objection that they are volleying than they are. That happens all of the time. So you may not even get to question 2. If you do, you should have already been through question 1, making sure that they understand what their objection, what their position is, and that you understand what their objection and position is. And so then question number 2, once we're to that point, is, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Or, something like, what do you find is the most compelling evidence that that's the case? So make them justify it. Okay, help them think through why they believe what. So first they need to understand what it is that they actually believe. If they get past that point, then they need to be able to justify to themselves and to you how they came to that conclusion. Okay, the why behind it. Now, very few conversations, especially in one sitting, end up getting to a third question. And that's why your goal, you have to understand and have a modest goal for this. Your modest goal for entering into any conversation, you need to stop thinking in terms of, I'm going to turn this person into a creationist. And you need to start thinking in terms of, I'm going to make this person think. I'm going to make this person question what they believe and think about it in a new way. That's your modest goal, and you can do that with question 1, with question 2, and with question 3. But maybe, let's say you've had a very in-depth or very productive conversation, and you've gotten to question 3, or maybe you're interacting with a friend over a long period of time, and you've gotten to question 3. Then the question becomes, well, have you ever considered And then you slide in at the end of that question a challenge that will help them to see a new way of thinking about it. Okay. Have you ever considered, or what about this? Have you thought about this? And by the way, you can use these questions as it relates to creationism, as it relates to politics, as it relates to where you're going to eat, dinner. You can think about all kinds of different ways to make these part of your regular conversation. And that's the cool thing about the Columbo approach. You see, for Detective Columbo, he would actually say, I'm sorry for asking so many of these questions. It's just kind of a habit. And Greg utilizes that in the way that he teaches and presents this concept. It's got to become a habit. It needs to become a habit, second nature, when you get into a discussion to ask these questions. Okay? So, because we have solid ground, both biblically and scientifically, to believe what we believe, that Columbo tactic helps us to express these ideas and draw other people's ideas out of them without sounding preachy, without being overbearing. It's an incredible tactic. It's persuasive because it's subtle. So let's take a look at an example and see if we can look at this in action. All right. So let's talk about like the most common, obvious scenario that you might run into when it comes to the age of the earth. You're in a conversation with a friend of yours who's an old earth creationist, and they say, the earth is billions of years old. Radiometric dating proves it. Here's how you might use each phase, each Columbo question, to actually turn that into a persuasive moment for you as the young age creationist, okay? So step one is going to be this: what do you mean by that question, okay? What do you mean by that? Now, when you get into the specifics, you're not going to just say, somebody says what they say, the earth is billions of years old, radiometric dating proves it. Well, what do you mean by that? You're not going to do that. Why? That's too general. Okay? That's too general. You're not being clear, so they cannot be clear. There's a handful of various questions along the lines of what do you mean by that you could actually ask in response to the statement, the earth is billions of years old, radiometric dating proves it. One example question you might say is, radiometric dating, cool. So what do you mean when you say that it proves billions of years? Like, what's it measuring? So what's happening here? Well, number one, it forces them to define their terms. Right? Like you've got terms in this conversation that you know because you're a well-studied creationist that you don't know yet if they even know. So why are you going to jump into some kind of diatribe when you may not even have to, because they may not even know the terms associated with what they're saying? Terms like decay rates or isotopes, right? Or the individual aspects of the assumptions that go into this, right? So what do you mean when you say that it proves billions of years? How exactly does that work? Okay. By the way, that's another way that you can sort of ask. That is a, what do you mean by that sort of question? Well, how does that work? I hope you're seeing, like, how many people have you talked to that they would actually be able to answer that question? Not many. Most people don't know the details. They just trust the headline. Okay. Now, they might come back with something like, well, it's, how long it takes for radioactive stuff in rocks to break down. Great. Now you've got them explaining instead of attacking. Okay. And it's going to set up the next question, right? And you say something like this for the next question. Well, interesting. So how does measuring that breakdown tell us the earth is billions of years old? What's the logic there? Okay. Now let's pause right here before we go on. This is just one example tree of questions that you could go down. Okay. There's other questions too. For example, you could have just started with, why Or you could have just started with the question like, well, how do you understand that radiometric dating works? That's a, what do you mean by that sort of question, right? You could just focus in on the proof. What do you mean by proof? What do you accept as a proof, right? That's another sort of, what do you mean by that question? Again, you're gathering information. You want to make sure that they understand what they're talking about. Okay, so following along the initial track, they say, well, it's how long it takes for radioactive stuff in rocks to break down. Okay, and maybe you could even clarify it with that. You could go into another, what do you mean by question? Radioactive stuff in rocks to break down. So what do you mean? Like, are you aware of the different types of elements that are involved in that process? Now, you are, my creationist friend. You know that parent elements decay over time via half-life processes, right, to daughter elements, okay? And you understand that the half-life is how long it takes for that radioactive parent to lose exactly one half and turn into its daughter element, okay? That's the half-life. You know that, but you don't know that they know that. And if they don't even know that, then it's very unlikely they're going to be able to make it too much further into a conversation about radiometric dating. And so if they can't answer that question, you might even just say, well, look, I would encourage you to actually do some study on this issue. Okay. And here are some resources that you can read that'll explain to you a little bit more about how radiometric dating works. You read those and then let's talk about it again. Okay. You can do that. That's an option you have. You can go ahead and get out of the conversation. You're safe. You don't even have to go any further if you don't want to. If you do want to go further, you can. But you can get out of the conversation at any time because you're always safe. Again, if you're just in that first phase of gathering information, this is so important because if you're listening to this as a rather new creationist, or at least a creationist who, you might be a little scared to get into conversations like this, just know you are safe. You don't have to go further than question number one, okay? Question number one, what do you mean by that? You could just gather information. You can leave the conversation by saying, that's interesting. Maybe they've come at it and actually they're a little bit more knowledgeable than you thought they were, or maybe even that you perceive yourself to be. And you could say, well, that's interesting. Actually, I had never really heard that before. Tell you what, let me step away, do a little bit of research, and how about I get back to you within the next week or so? Does that sound good? They're going to say yes to that. Okay. Maybe they'll do the opposite. Maybe they'll give you resources to read. Fine. So yeah, I'll gladly read these resources. Okay, fine. Get educated on the subject matter. If we believe that the truth is in the scriptures, and we believe that young age creationism is the correct position, then we have nothing to worry about, no matter how much new knowledge we take in, right? Okay, so we're moving the conversation forward. How did you come to that conclusion? Example question, right? Interesting. So, how does measuring that breakdown of the radioactive stuff in rocks, how does that tell us that the Earth is billions of years old? What's the logic there? Now, why does this work? Because it pushes them to reveal the assumptions, okay? For example, constant decay rates, right? No contamination, things like that. It pushes them to reveal the assumptions that go into the actual process and the assumptions that they have in the process, which opens the door to you critiquing them without even saying a word yet. Okay, you might get a response, especially if they're a little bit more uneducated, that says something like this. Well, scientists say it's been going on forever, and they've tested it. Now, again, you can follow up here, right? Forever. Tested how? Right? They might trip over those assumptions, which is perfect for your step 3, okay? Assuming you're going this far in the conversation. You could say, that's a neat process. Remember, we're moving on to step 3. We're in the have you considered section now, okay? Now, this is the question that makes a point in the form of a question that invites them to think about this challenge, okay? So you say something like this, well, that's a neat process. Have you ever considered, though, how something like a global flood could throw off those dates? Like, say, if tons of sediment got buried very fast with messed up isotope ratios, might that make rocks look older than they are now? So here's why that works. it drops a big cornerstone of the young age creationist argument, right? Flood geology. But as a question, not as a sermon, right? You're not preaching at them. You're not dropping big facts on them. You're just saying, what if a global flood was part of the factors here? Would that make rocks look older than they are? Now, it challenges their view, but it makes you look like the curious one. Okay? You're still in the driver's seat. Now, maybe they respond like this if they're, again, a little bit more on the uneducated side in these debates. A flood, well, yeah, I guess that could change things, but wouldn't we see evidence of such a flood? Now, if you want to get out of the conversation at this point, you could. Or if you want to keep going, you could. Good point. Well, what kind of evidence would you expect? Ever heard of, say, massive fossil graveyards or bent rock layers? And now you're really rolling in the conversation, right? You're actually talking about the points that you know to be true and helping them to understand the finer points of creationist thinking without demanding, or rather without simply giving them an information dump, some sort of download of information that they're probably not even going to be remember. We don't want to be a steamroller here. We want to invite them to carefully consider one thing at a time. You're not proving young age creationism here. You're just planting a seed. Now they're thinking about the flood and not just dismissing you offhand like they would have perhaps in the past. Now, maybe the flood thing, if they're a little bit more knowledgeable, takes you down a different road. They might say, well, that assumes a global flood exists at all. And you might say something like this. There's so many ways you can handle this, okay? Me, and I talk about this in the book, and I give an example of how to do this. I'm a fan of not chasing rabbit holes, okay? So I like, or rabbit trails, I guess I should say. I like having one goal for any conversation. And by the way, negotiators will tell you to do this as well. You're going to go into the conversation with a goal or modest set of goals that you want to accomplish. And if you don't accomplish those goals, I recommend having one for any individual conversation. Then, you're just trying to do too much. Okay. So my goal is to get somebody in this conversation here considering that they might be thinking wrong about the assumptions behind radiometric dating. And usually you can set your goal for the conversation within the first few moments because they're going to raise that first question. I mean, only if you come to resolution on the first question should you really be moving on to others. Okay, so if they raise something like the global flood, I would say, well, like whether or not that's biblically accurate. I would say, listen, you bring up a good point. In fact, there is a wide variety of perspectives on whether or not the flood is global in Scripture. And we can talk about that. But for now, we're on the subject of radiometric dating. Let me just invite you to assume with me that a global flood was true, that the Bible really does teach a global flood, that all throughout church history, while the church has believed in a global flood, that they were not wrong, that they were right about that. Would that, in your view, affect the evidence that we see? Right? So you're telling them that you're aware of the scholarship there. You're even throwing in just a slight little fact there, reinforcing your idea, which is that, yep, they've believed in the global flood all throughout church history. It's kind of a rather new thing to take a local flood option, right? Which, people are going to most knowledgeable people are going to argue those points. But again, you don't want to go down the rabbit holes, okay? The rabbit trails. You want to try to stay with the main subject. Try to get them to agree with you at least that if the flood is global, it could have implications for the age of the earth. And then you're moving forward, okay? Again, you're in the driver's seat. You can get out of this conversation anytime you want to. Let's say that you didn't, let's say you're not very studied up on the other positions on the flood. Let's say you didn't even know. Maybe you're really new and you didn't even know there was like other positions on the flood. You could say, wow, well, I'm not going to lie. I was kind of under the impression that the church has always believed in a global flood. Would you mind providing me to the Bible verses that you think most argue for a local flood? And I'll go research and study those, and then we can catch up in a few days. How does that sound? Boom. You're out of the hot seat. No pressure. You've asked another question. You're letting them, you still put the onus on their back. You've still reversed the burden of proof because now they have to provide you with scriptures that indicate that the flood is local instead of global. By the way, that's very hard to do. And they may not even be able to do that, which is going to be information for you to use in your next conversation. Okay. Let me give you another really quick example, one that we hear all the time. Okay. Someone says, well, fossils take millions of years to form. All right. Step one. What do you mean by takes millions of years to form? Step two. How do you figure fossils need that long to form? Step three. Have you ever considered how fast fossils can form under the right conditions, like a flood burying things quickly? And then you can point to all these individual examples that exist, right? So, again, you could go through this with so many different things, but I so very much encourage you, hey, read Greg Koukl's book on tactics. Go watch some YouTube videos on the concept. Really take this in because I think it's going to help transform your creation conversations. And this is just one tactic. This is the Columbo tactic. There's a whole book full of other tactics, right? So it starts with the Columbo tactic and it goes into a bunch of other tactics. And then there's a whole other book that he wrote called Street Smarts, which helps you in very specific scenarios apply the tactics. So there's lots of learning for you to do if this is interesting. But if you did nothing for the next 5 years, but practiced using those 3 conversations, what do you mean by that? Those questions in conversation. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And have you ever considered? If you take just those 3 questions for the next 5 years and practice getting good at them and making them a habit in your conversations, you'd be surprised how much more effective you're going to be. What's really interesting is you're going to give people the perception, even if you don't feel that you are. You're going to give people the perception that you're extremely smart. And guess what? All you're doing is let them do all the talking. Kind of amazing. So practice these questions out loud. Use them in conversation. It'll feel clunky at first, but it'll get smoother and you'll eventually pick up the variations on the questions. Again, in most cases, you're not going to specifically say, what do you mean by that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Okay, these are just variations that you can use of those questions, okay? Stay chill. Smile, nod, let them talk. Remember, you're not going to be debating. You're not debating. You're asking questions. You're Columbo. You're sly like a fox, okay? And very helpful, know your basics. Know the basics of your view. Talking about creationism. Know about the flood. Know about dating flaws. Know about the biblical studies behind the concepts of young age creationism. Know how to argue for closed genealogies instead of open genealogies. Know what those terms are. Build your database of knowledge and then only pull the knowledge out as it's useful for making points and helping other people think and consider. And, well, you'll be extremely effective for creationism. I promise. All right. I hope this has been helpful for you. And use these conversations, use these questions. Let me know how it goes for you. God bless. Y'all take care. See you next time on the Winsome Creationist.